his recent book, In the Light of Justice, The Rise of Human Rights in Native America and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, examines the proposition that Native American rights are inalienable human rights. He's aware of the good work Lummi Nation has done to defend Cherry Point from the coal trains, and he's aware of other issues that relate to the tribes that Northwest Indian College serves, as well as the work presented here today by our Native scholars. I'm pleased and honored to introduce him to you. So please help me to welcome Walter Echo Hawk and join me in attentively listening and being inspired as emerging scholars and activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Danae, for that very kind and generous introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. I bring you well wishes from the state of Oklahoma. And I want to thank Danae for that very kind and generous introduction. I also would like, before I begin, to thank my nephew, Johnny Buck, for the wonderful prayer song, Kaitsi Yao Yao. Dr. Brian Thompson for the invitation to come and speak here at the university, the college, as well as all of the programs and departments and staff that have made my visit possible. And especially to my two lady chaperones, Carol and Danae, who picked me up at the airport yesterday and gave me a tour of this awesome place where we are in today. And I need to thank Carol and her husband, for this wonderful, very impressive food that we've had today. I really appreciate that. And also to thank each and every one of you for coming this afternoon, for being here. I look forward to being with you this afternoon. And I want to pay my respects to the great Lummi Nation for my privilege, of course, of being a guest in this awesome homeland, Lummi homeland here on beside the ocean, where the habitat is so magnificent, overshadowing us here humans that live here. And I'm just really pleased to be in this country. This is my first time to actually be at the university here, and I'm very impressed, by this institution, as well as the tribal homeland here today. And I want to begin by also saying how humbled I am to be here to participate in this celebration of Native scholars. And I want to commend and congratulate each and every one of the Native scholars here today that have been honored this morning, that have participated so far. And wish you well in all of your academic endeavors, from here forward. We're at the end of this school year, and you've come this far, and I hope that the Great Spirit will be with you in your coming studies and the things that you do, because you are literally our next generation. And I would challenge each of you to be warrior scholars, because to use your education to the benefit of our families and our peoples and our tribes and our magnificent tribal homelands that we are blessed with. I feel like our survival and our well-being, our health and well-being really is in the hands of our generation that is here in this room. And so I do wish you well, in the coming years. I think that you have many role models that you can look to in whatever careers you go forward in. Because during the last two generations, during the modern era of federal Indian law in our tribal sovereignty movement, our Native scholars have played a very critical role along the way in our tribal sovereignty movement and contributed to the stirring rise of our modern Indian nations that we see here. And I want to talk a little bit about the rise of our modern Indian nations and the role that our scholars in the past generations have played in bringing us to where we are today. During the course of that, we can look to not only our tribal leaders and our traditional people that devoted themselves, you know, to this tribal sovereignty movement, but also to our scholars, the scholarship. I think we were blessed, have been blessed in the modern era by a lot of really good scholarship, you know, beginning with our traditional knowledge, our traditional elders and wisdom keepers that have kept the faith, so to speak, during times of adversity, as well as some of the leading examples out there, like the late Vine Deloria, you know, who was a really profound thinker, religious and political thinker, you know, for our generation. He was, I think, a prototype of the warrior scholar that I would commend to you as a role model, as well as folks like Professor Gregory Quixote, you know, on indigenous habitat from the University of New Mexico, and others out there. In my own tribe, my brother Roger Echohoff, James Writing In were like historians that helped our tribe on repatriation issues. And there are many, many out there over the past two generations that contributed their scholarship in the causes that and challenges that faced our peoples. And so I think, though, in you today, our future is in good hands, you know, and I am so glad to be here. And again, I appreciate the college for propagating your scholarship and also bringing me here today. What I wanted to talk about, my topic this afternoon is indigenous habitat, health, and well-being. And I have to say, in making this presentation, I'm really awestruck by this awesome habitat that we're in today, as well as being in the really heart of some real traditional tribal country here in the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Oklahoma, a landlubber, and they're actually almost in the center. Our Aboriginal homeland is in the center of the Great Plains, almost the perfect center of the United States. But I'm not from this wonderful part of our country. So my observations that I want to share with you are based upon my experience as a native rights attorney who has represented Indian tribes since 1973 here in Washington State, in Oregon, Northern California, British Columbia, as well as Southeast Alaska. In my observations about indigenous habitat that I wanted to share with you, and the relationship between habitat, health, and well-being. And so also I would say also family experiences as well, because my wife is Wanapum, and also from raised at the Umatilla Reservation and enrolled at the Yakima Reservation. You know, and I've had the opportunity to participate in some of the longhouse ceremonies there on that reservation. Priest Rapids, where nephew's from. So what I'd like to do today is basically cover three areas with you, if I may. First of all, I'd like to define or attempt to define or give you my definition of indigenous habitat. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the role of Native scholars and scholarship in protecting indigenous habitat over the past couple generations, and giving a few examples from this part of the country as our tribal nations work to protect their habitat. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk about the role of human rights as we look to the future. The role of human rights and Native scholars in the future protecting indigenous habitat, as I'm going to try to define it. And here I want to talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because this brand new international human rights instrument lays out some very important human rights with respect to indigenous habitat. And I would want to bring this to your attention because to date, all of our efforts to protect indigenous habitat have arisen from federal Indian law and sometimes environmental law as well. And all of that is totally bereft of the human rights principle. And so now today, in the year 2016, we have a brand new human rights framework that we can begin utilizing in protecting indigenous habitat over the next generation. So I wanted to talk a bit about that new legal framework that we now have, and perhaps lay out some recommendations for our Native scholars in this next generation for implementing those standards in protecting the work of protecting our indigenous habitat. So with that, let me, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions afterwards. And I'm going to need, obviously, to brush with some broad strokes here. But my first task is to try to identify indigenous habitat, and I'm going to try to do so from the standpoint of a legal practitioner. But I would, I guess, begin by saying this concept of not habitat, but indigenous habitat, I think is all important to the survival of our tribes, especially our tribes that continue to live in our Aboriginal homelands, that continue to practice our hunting, fishing, and gathering ways of life. I can think of nothing more important than the habitats. That is the land, the sea, and the waters that produce the habitat where we live. The habitat that produce our cultures and our ways of life. So let me try to define what I would consider indigenous habitat as simply a functioning, healthy, and productive ecosystem comprised of traditional lands, waters, and natural resources, including animals and plants, fish, marine mammals, populations, in our ancestral homelands, currently or traditionally owned, occupied, or used by indigenous peoples to carry on their cultures and their traditional ways of life. This habitat is in the natural world, and it gave rise to our very beautiful and profound indigenous cultures that we have today, our cosmologies or our worldviews, our songs, our ceremonies, our architecture, foods that we eat, our value systems, are all, I think, a reflection of our close ties to our indigenous habitats and the places where our tribal peoples reside in our country. And without these habitats, they're so important, it seems to me, that our Aboriginal cultures can't survive without these indigenous habitats. And it's very clear to me, having practiced law in the Pacific Northwest, Indian water rights cases, treaty rights, fishing rights, that the habitats, our indigenous habitats, as I have defined them, are a key to our health and our well-being. Because the habitats produce our food, our traditional foods, the roots, our first plants, come from the soil beneath our feet. The fish that swims in the rivers, that comes from the in-stream flow habitats in the Kitzkitaway, which means ocean in my language, the ruling water. The game, big game, elk and deer. The sea life, our foods that, come from the ocean. It's very clear that our habitat is linked to our food supply. And it also is the, our foods, as we know in traditional communities, is always at the center of conversation. How it's gathered, how it's obtained, how it's prepared, how it's preserved, how it's eaten. Everyone just talks about food, our traditional and our sacred foods. So I think that our health and our well-being, even our culture and our identity are inextricably linked to our indigenous habitats here in the Pacific Northwest. And that has a lot to do, it seems to me, also with our cultural sovereignty. That is the inner strength of Native America, that underpinning of our political sovereignty, that which gives our peoples their spiritual power, gives our nations a foundation upon which to exercise their political sovereignty. Again, is tied back to our habitat, especially, I think, in this part of the country, it seems to me. I think that in a nutshell, then, indigenous habitat, as I have defined it, is inextricably linked to our health and our well-being as indigenous peoples. And of course, it depends on a healthy ecosystem, a healthy, productive, functioning environment that produces populations of harvestable populations, of fish and game and plants. And that's hard to protect. In our country, the protection of our indigenous habitat is one of our biggest challenges today. And over the last 2 generations, during the modern era of federal Indian law, many of the legal battles that were fought to protect indigenous habitat, as I have defined it. And I'd like to talk about that effort now. The protection of our indigenous habitat. Things that are important to Native people are never freely given. They always have to be fought for and demanded and fought for and then vigilantly protected. And that goes for protecting our indigenous habitat during the modern era of federal Indian law. And in that process, over the past 2 generations, since 1970, Native scholars and scholarship played a very important role in the successes that we have seen. And I want to kind of review some of the case studies, you know, in this part of the country, but I think historically, by way of a background, I have to start with the idea of colonialism, because historically, indigenous habitat all over the world has been hard to protect ever since European contact. If we look back to this colonial era from 1492 all the way till, I'm going to say, the late 60s, when the UN condemned colonialism, we've seen that the colonization of native lands is always invariably accompanied by the destruction of indigenous habitat. You can't have one without the other, it seems to me. And why is that? The purpose of the driving goal of any colony was to displace the natives, not only here in the United States, but around the world. Africa, Asia, most of Asia, the entire Western Hemisphere, the islands out in the Pacific, the circumpolar world. The goal of the colonies was to displace the native aboriginal populations with the new incoming colonists. And also then to begin extracting natural resources, often over-exploiting those resources in that process. For example, the whaling nations, for example, during this 500-year period, you know, over-exploited the oceans and the whale populations to the point to where impinging upon the indigenous whaling nation harvest. We could see that. Another example of that, I think, here in the Puget Sound, where prior to USD Washington, which I think was talked about earlier, the native treaty fishermen had been crowded out of the fishery to where they were only able to harvest about 2% of the catchable runs. And so they were forced to go to court in the USD Washington case to establish their treaty right to 50% of the harvest. But I think one characteristic of the settlement of native lands has been the killing off of the wildlife, running them off as pests, I guess you could say, and changes in the environment that today have led to the mass extinction of animals and plants. As we see, and we can see around the world, the efforts of colonialism and post-colonialism to basically remake the natural world, to alter the hydrology and the land itself, to remake the natural world for Western-style agriculture or manufacturing. And we can see that in the way, for example, in our own country, how the Forest Service colonized southeast Alaska and the Tongass National Forest, where Teddy Roosevelt, by executive order, created a massive national forest in the Tlingit homeland and our nation's largest rainforest, and began to convert what the Tlinkits had used was awesome hunting, fishing, and gathering indigenous habitat into a pulp mill and a paper industry, you know, seeing the forest only in terms of board feet. We can see it in my part of the country out on the Great Plains, you know, as the steel plows turned upside down the prairie grass and the efforts to exterminate father buffalo. We can see it in the here locally in Puget Sound area, in the efforts over on the White River in Muckleshoot country, where the Puget Sound Power and Light Company basically diverted 20 miles of the White River, diverted it all the way around the Muckleshoot Reservation for a hydro project. Basically hogged or gobbled up all of the water to generate electric power, destroying the salmon run in the White River. And also, we could move further south into the Klamath River Basin in southern Oregon and northern California, where dams were installed on the main stem of the Klamath without fish ladders, which exterminated the salmon habitat in the northern upper watershed of the Klamath. These, I think, are examples of efforts to the adverse impacts, if you will, on indigenous habitat as Europeans and their descendants attempted to remake the land for other uses besides the natural world functions of indigenous that's served by indigenous habitat. The impact, of course, of habitat destruction on indigenous peoples has always been very severe, resulting in literally bringing the Plains Indians, for example, to their knees during the Indian Wars out there, causing the starvation years without the Greek herd. We couldn't live on rations alone when we were put onto the reservations. People starved and they went hungry. Hunger became a way of life after that habitat was destroyed. Some tribes, in the process of colonization and habitat destruction, actually went extinct in our country during the colonial period. I think that the habitat destruction has been attributed by those who study population loss to the decline or the implosion of our Native American population in the United States, which by the year 1900 teetered on the brink of extinction. And anthropologists such as Russell Thornton have attributed a number of causes to this shocking population collapse, to warfare and disease and other factors, removal, but also listing habitat destruction as one of the causes for this very disturbing population collapse that was witnessed, in our encounter with Manifest Destiny. So I think the importance of indigenous habitat and its destruction are very important factors in the health and the well-being of and the survival, I think, of our tribal peoples here, not only here in the United States, but around the world. During the modern era of federal Indian law, from, I'm going to say, 1970 to the current day, there were mounted and determined efforts across the country by Indian nations to protect their remaining indigenous habitat from further destruction. And I want to recount this modern era and give you some examples of tribal efforts to protect indigenous habitat and the role that scholars played in that process. Beginning in 1970, when President Nixon announced the brand new Indian self-determination policy. That was a dramatic break in the failed federal policies of the past of forcible assimilation, of termination, of relocation. And based on advocacy by indigenous leaders, President Nixon finally came to the point where he broke with those policies, and he announced this brand new policy of Indian self-determination, which remains in effect today. Among those, and the self-determination policy was very simple. It was to simply give the tribes control over their own destinies, to make decisions based on tribal aspirations and tribal needs, and let the tribes determine their own destiny. That's a human right. That's a universal human right of self-determination. But President Nixon went to Congress and made that announcement in 1970, and some of the Vine Deloria was among the Native thinkers that helped articulate notions of Indian self-determination, the principles of it, the concept of it, and the aspirations, that tribal self-determination promoted in Indian country, and to distinguish that from the civil rights movement, which was the larger civil rights movement that was going on in the 1960s, where Black America was in the civil rights movement, seeking equality under the law. And Vine Deloria and his colleagues, they put this idea of self-determination and tribal sovereignty at the center of the Indian movement for better rights in America. And so that ultimately coalesced into this Indian self-determination policy that was embraced by President Nixon, which remains the policy of our nation to this very day. But it came forward from our tribal leaders, our Native advocates, and our scholarship, as illustrated through Vine Deloria's work, historic work at that time. And so in 1970, this policy didn't have any teeth in it. It was unenforceable, it was not implemented, and it became the work of the tribal sovereignty movement, the students, the tribal leaders, the attorneys of that day. Their challenge of that hour was to implement that Indian self-determination policy across the land so that every Indian nation, every tribal community would be able to be a self-determining peoples. And so that became the work of two generations, to implement that policy through attorneys, through legislation, through litigation, through social change, and along the way to confirm our treaty rights and establish our tribal governments, refine and expand the exercise of their governmental powers, to promote and protect our cultural sovereignty, as well as to improve the health and well-being and social conditions of our people along the way. This was all done within the legal framework of federal Indian law. And this body of federal Indian law is federal law that is derived from international law, from the U.S. Constitution, from treaties with Indian nations, from acts of Congress, from Supreme Court decisions, and even traditional tribal law. That provided the legal framework for the tribal sovereignty movement and the rise of our modern Indian nations. But among all of of these challenges that were addressed by our forebears over the past 2 generations since 1970, it seems to me that one of the most difficult challenges has been to protect our indigenous habitat, so that we would be able to exercise our treaty rights and enjoy our cultures and cosmologies. I want to give you some examples of that effort here in this part of our country, the Pacific Northwest, that took place during that time, and pointing out the scholarship that helped those efforts. I think that, of course, habitat in this part of the country is especially important. As I mentioned earlier, the Indian nations, like the Lummi Nation here, still live in their aboriginal homelands since time immemorial, still hunt, fish, and gather, as our forebears have done from time immemorial, still have and exercise treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather to support that way of life. So therefore, the tribes in this part of the country are well known as leaders throughout Indian country in protecting their habitat, to protect our habitat here and the traditional uses of those habitats. And so that there's a very rich legal history in this part of the country of tribal nations going forward, often in David versus Goliath kinds of battles and struggles, to really protect their way of life that arose from our habitats here. And I think that the fact that we still have robust environmental ecosystems in this part of the country is attributable to the determined effort of the native tribes here to protect the environment of this neck of the woods, I guess. I wanted to, of course, we've got to begin with looking at U.S. v. Washington. And I know you talked about it earlier today, so I won't dwell on the Volt decision, of the 1974 and the Ninth Circuit affirming it 10 years later. But it was a landmark case that was filed at the very dawn of the Indian self-determination era of modern federal Indian law. It was propelled by our tribal fishermen, our very brave, activist tribal fishermen who refused to give up. They were being crowded out of the fishery, only harvesting 2% of the harvestable runs, being arrested by all of the authorities, being hounded by hostile commercial fishermen and the public at large. People like Billy Frank, and every tribe in this region had their own Billy Franks that were activists at that time. But they marched into federal court and engaged in a hostile, pitched battle in U.S. v. Washington, and used the federal court system as the great equalizer there, and came out with a very heroic decision that basically held that treaty rights are alive and well, and they have to be enforced, that the in common language of the Stephen treaties meant not 2% of the harvestable runs, but 50% of the harvestable runs. And that historic decision also opened the door to a habitat discussion as well in phase 2 of U.S. v. Washington, which the courts are beginning to rule and talk about and have issued rulings that a treaty fishing right also has an implied treaty right for sufficient habitat to protect the fishery right, the fishing right. And so that case was propelled, that historic case was propelled by scholarship. Not only the legal scholarship that went into that litigation, but also there was a lot of splendid expert witness testimony, anthropological testimony that was offered in that case by the late and great Dr. Barbara Lane. She was a non-Indian anthropologist from Vancouver. That was relied upon very heavily by Judge Bolt in that decision. Her scholarship, about the meaning of these treaties at the time they were negotiated, what that language meant in common to the Indians at the time in question, given their practices at the time. The Supreme Court said fishing is just as important to the Indians out here as the air they breathe. And that came from a lot of Barbara Lane's scholarship in that case, as well as the scholarship that came to us through our activist fishermen, because their persistence in exercising their traditional subsistence patterns from the ocean and the waters of this region was nothing less than the wisdom of our elders that they were carrying forward there. And so that was a landmark case. It's considered to be a landmark case down to this very day. Another one of the same kind of a category for Oregon is United States versus Adair, involving the Klamath Indians in southern Oregon, a case that I was involved in for almost 3 decades, which involved the Adair decision. The federal courts held that the on-reservation treaty fishing rights of the Klamath tribes survived the Klamath Termination Act. The Klamath Termination Act was passed in the 1950s. It resulted in the taking of their land. But in that act, it said, nothing herein shall affect any treaty or any Indian water rights. And so even though the government took all of their land, leaving them landless, they still had their treaty rights and the water necessary to support that. The federal court agreed with the Klamath on that and said these rights still survive, and they are enforceable treaty rights, and the tribe has enough water to satisfy these treaties. And the federal court left it to the state of Oregon to quantify how much water it is, how much water Canadian migratory waterfowl need, how much camas need, how much water shellfish and all of the fisheries and the different plants, riparian plants, lakes and seeps and springs, what are the needs of the big game and all of the treaty animals that are hunted, fish or plants that are gathered. That led to a very lengthy general stream adjudication put on by the state of Oregon. It was a very complex, multi-party, complex litigation with over 600 parties to quantify all of the water rights to the waters, lakes, streams, seeps, and springs of the upper Klamath River watershed. And in that proceeding, the state ALJs developed a legal standard to quantify how much water these animals and plants needed based on a habitat standard. The court, after extensive briefing, came up with a very robust habitat standard and said that the water right is for enough water necessary for a productive habitat to sustain harvestable populations of all these animals and plants and fish. And so under that robust habitat standard. So far, the Klamath tribes have won their entire water right claim. Every drop that they have asserted has been awarded to them so far in that lengthy proceeding. And it's causing a very important case because it's really causing the courts a first time for a very extensive habitat discussion or judicial discourse on what is habitat, how much water does it take to have a robust habitat for tribal hunting, fishing, and gathering purposes. Again, based on scholarship. Again, in that case, we used Dr. Barbara Lane. We used all kinds of tribal biologists, government biologists, wildlife biologists, fishery biologists, waterfowl biologists, and also very, very powerful tribal testimony from the hunters, fishers, and gatherers who I spent one whole summer going out and inventorying all of the plants in the watershed with their tribal gatherers who pointed out all of the uses of these different plants in the riparian zone, that were used for medicine, for food, other uses, a veritable pharmacy, nature's grocery store, I guess. And then our experts determined how much water these plants needed to produce in harvestable populations. So scholarship was very important again in that case as well. I could go, how am I doing on time here? Does anyone know how many minutes I got left?
More than 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes? Okay. I'm going to speed up a bit. Other cases, Muckleshoot Indian Tribe versus Puget Power Light Company. Case I worked on for the Muckleshoots. I alluded to it earlier about protecting the tribe's treaty fishing rights in the White River from being diverted by the power company, and also the city of Auburn diverting most of the waters of a Coal Creek tributary. Again, scholarship played a role in that case. There are other cases in Oregon, Kandra versus United States, again involving the Klamath tribes and the water war of the year 2000 when there was a big drought down there. The Bureau of Reclamation curtailed all irrigation withdrawals from the massive Bureau of Reclamation agriculture irrigation project in order to protect a tribal treaty fishery that was also endangered species as well. And in that case, the court, there was two legal theories there, the Endangered Species Act coupled with the tribal trust obligation of the federal government to protect the treaty fishery. Very powerful habitat tools. And the court upheld the Bureau of Reclamation's decision to cut off all water diversions for agriculture for the first time in about 70 years. And that prompted this lawsuit by the farmers. They lost their case in part due to the tribal testimony in there from the biologists as well as the fishermen that talked about the adverse impacts on their treaty fishing rights if they continue to divert water during that drought period. Also, we have to remember that our habitat there's a religious component, or we have religious habitat in the natural world that was also litigated in this part of the country in the Klamath Falls case in Montana, which is a Kootenai vision questing site where a power company wanted to divert the Klamath River around this waterfall to dewater, a waterfall that was inhabited by the Wicca, the spirits relied upon by the Klamath people, Kootenai people, for vision questing. And they went into the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, was deciding whether to grant that permit or not under the Federal Power Act, which involves a public interest test. Was it in the public interest to grant this permit to dewater this massive waterfall? And the court held that it was not in the public interest because it would destroy this vision questing site. Again, based on very, very powerful testimony by traditional religious practitioners who had to get a protective order to seal that record because they were not allowed by their religion to just talk about it, to disclose their religious tenets to anyone outside of the community. So in order to allow them to testify, we had to get a protective order to seal their testimony, to seal that record, and even to seal that part of the opinion that was issued by FERC, which is still in place to this very day. That scholarship basically was our traditional wisdom keepers that came forward to protect their holy place. And we can look, coming full circle back to our part of the country, to the wonderful Makah whaling story, where the Makah Nation revived its whaling hunt that had gone dormant for over 70 years due to the lack of whales, due to over whaling by our nations around the world. And yet the tribal culture retained their whaling knowledge, their values related to that way of life, and it was stored as a treasure trove deep within their culture, despite efforts by the government to erase that culture. Despite the lack of whales, it still resided in their treasure trove of wisdom, tribal wisdom, and they were able to resume those hunts after the populations were restored a little bit, after they went through international and domestic proceedings, even in the face of local hostility by animal rights activists. Their whaling hunts and culture remains alive and well, being one of the few tribes that actually have a whaling treaty right in their treaty. And so their efforts and rivals, it seems to me, U.S. v. Washington, in terms of opening the door to some of our very rare indigenous whaling societies that we still have in our country. And it's a testament to the cultural survival, the determination of our people to survive with our cultures intact. That I think is a very inspirational story to all of Indian country, and I think the rest of the country that is interested in cultural diversity within our own nation. And then we have the scholarship at play here again was traditional wisdom that was kept by our culture bearers over there at Makah. And then here at home, we of course have this Cherry Point Coal Terminal case where the Army Corps of Engineers just this last month denied a Army Corps of Engineer permit for this coal terminal. So that was a very successful effort to protect indigenous habitat in our waters here, and I commend the Lummi tribal leaders and the fishermen, Attorney praise, everyone involved in that effort to do that. I think that, again, this is a great follow-on to U.S. v. Washington. It puts teeth into that. It shows it still has meaning today. That continues to make the federal government accountable to our treaties, and just a wonderful thing to see. So we have these stirring examples, but I have to say, as I conclude, I'm going to try to move fastly here, that nevertheless, federal Indian law still needs to be strengthened to protect our indigenous habitat, because these not all tribes have treaties like we do in this part of the country, and the sticking point are these off-reservation parts of indigenous habitat that are outside of tribal control. Federal Indian law offers no protections. We have to look to general environmental law, which often is ineffectual. Too little, too late, for example, in the Endangered Species Act. It doesn't kick in until a species is teetering on the brink of extinction. That's too little, too late, it seems to me, for a vibrant hunters, fishers, and gathering tribes up here. So I think that we need to strengthen our law to get some reliable legal protections in place in this next generation to protect our indigenous habitat that's tied to our health and well-being. If you look around the country, you see the mass extinction of animals and plants, environmental degradation going on at rapid pace, far outstripping the ability of the law to protect our remaining habitats from destruction. And so I would submit to you that I think the single most grave threat to our existence as tribal hunters, fishers, and gatherers is this habitat destruction that's going on all around us. And so I would hope that we can find some additional remedies in the law to help protect the remaining habitats that we still have today. We could look at our own health and wellness statistics and see that there's still big gaps in our health and well-being. Our tribal peoples are 600% more likely to die of TB, for example. 510% more likely to die from alcoholism. 189% more likely to die of diabetes. 40% more likely to die of pneumonia or flu, and our children are at risk here. So we need, I think, a legal lifeline to protect our sacred foods that we still revere. And I think we can look to this new human rights era now that is given to us by this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was the United Nations General Assembly approved this landmark document in the year 2007. The United States endorsed it in the year 2010, making this UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples technically a part of U.S. policy. And so I think we stand now at the dawn of a brand new era in federal Indian law and policy, the human rights era. And in that document, which it lists a whole bunch of inherent human rights for indigenous peoples, not rights that are made up by the UN, but are drawn from the larger body of modern international human rights law, through norms and customary international law, through UN human rights treaty provisions, and they pulled from that recognized human rights by that modern body of law, and put it in this declaration so that indigenous peoples will have the same human rights that everybody else already takes for granted. But there's a number of provisions in that document that lays out inherent human rights to indigenous habitat, to protect the reproductive capacity and environmental integrity of indigenous habitat, to protect indigenous uses of traditional lands, whether owned currently or traditionally used, as inherent human rights, which is a very special category of legal rights, which are sort of recognized as a matter of natural law that come to us from a higher source, that the founding fathers alluded to in the Declaration of Independence, notions of life, liberty, and justice, that all free and democratic nations were formed to protect, the kinds of rights that no nation can take away, such as the right to be free from genocide, slavery, widespread discrimination. These inherent human rights are rights that we enjoy from a higher source that nobody can take away, that Congress can't take away, the Supreme Court, without being branded an outlaw in the eyes of international law. And so a lot of the cases that I mentioned earlier, they were all decided without the benefit of these human rights. They were based solely on federal Indian law, treaties, and basically the law of colonialism. But now we can look to this brand new legal framework of human rights and add in, also deny the Cherry Point coal port because it violates the human rights of the Maumee people, to their indigenous habitat. And so I invite you to read this document and those provisions in there that address our right to traditional subsistence, our spiritual relationship to the lands and waters, our rights, our traditional rights of uses, and the duty of the states to conserve and protect the environmental capacity of these areas as human rights. Currently, these are not legally enforceable, but it's our challenge of this generation. Just like back in 1970, it was our challenge to implement Indian self-determination through laws of litigation, social change. We need to implement these human rights standards into American law and policy. And I think in that process, our native scholars are going to have a seat at the table, to help us develop a land ethic, for example, through white papers and discussions with ecologists and pulling out our indigenous values that are ingredients for a workable land and sea ethic. And also a seat at the table to have a public discourse about the nature and content of human rights for Native Americans that are laid out in this document. And our scholars, the young people here, will have a seat at that table. Institutions such as the Northwest Indian College here, teach our young people the language of human rights, that they can be conversant in this declaration, like they are up in Canada. The First Nations up there are already litigating in their courts up there under this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Their government up there has now taken some very significant steps towards beginning to implement this declaration into the Canadian law and policy. And we need to do the same in our country here to strengthen our indigenous legal rights and put ourselves on a human rights footing here on all of our aspirations. So with that, I think I probably overrun my time, but I want to again thank everyone for my opportunity to share these thoughts. And I'm just so glad that I was able to come and be here and take part in your gathering today, and I appreciate all of the kindnesses, that have been rendered to me on my visit. Thank you.
I think we still have some time for some questions. So if anybody has any questions,
There's
take a little
some time for some questions, as long as they're easy ones.
I had a question for you. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the Columbia River Treaty renegotiation and the opportunities for Indigenous communities along the Columbia River to renegotiate as a state actor along with the United States and Canada. If you're familiar with that renegotiation process and what are the opportunities for tribes?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that. I said no hard questions.
I know. It's very
Anyone else? Ma'am?
So what happened in Arizona regarding where they gave a corporation the rights to mine on sacred lands? And actually, I think the senator, what's his name, was involved with that too.
I'm not familiar with that particular case, but the whole question of protecting maybe holy places on state and federal lands remains very problematic. Under the U.S. Supreme Court, Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery decided in 1988, there is absolutely no First Amendment legal constitutional right to those kinds of protections. That's still the law of the land today. The Kootenai Falls case that I mentioned earlier was successful, but it was decided under the Federal Power Act, not the First Amendment of the United States. And so it's very hard to find some good, solid legal protections to protect our holy places. And that remains one of the challenges of this next generation. And I think that UN declaration will help there, because it does address holy places and our right to worship and religious liberty.
So we'll do one last question.
Sir?
What do you think of one of our political candidates on the Republican side saying he's going to close down the EPA?
Don't get me started.
I guess we have one student question that we really needed today.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us. I'm a student in the Native Environmental Science program, and how would you advise us as Native scholars to influence these federal law policies? Because we're coming from a scientific kind of background without any kind of history within policy or any kind of knowledge of that. So
I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's a big seat at the table for our Native scholars on these areas, on habitat protection issues, to develop a land ethic, to pull out the indigenous value systems that could be ingredients for a land or sea ethic, and to articulate, help us articulate human rights with regard to habitat. And so I think through your scholarship, through your writing of articles and your research papers, participating in roundtable discussions, sharing your knowledge with our tribal leaders. There's many areas, that I think that you not only have to be scholars and know your way to the library, but you have to be warrior scholars, able to communicate your knowledge to the tribes and to the public at large. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Just like our tribal fishery biologists, very good young biologists who are also versed in advocacy as combat biologists, to negotiate with the state every year on the harvest allocations and all of the controversies and issues that arise, with tribes, protecting and exercising our fishing license. So I think there's going to be plenty of avenues out there, we really do need our scholars to help us articulate our human rights and our rights to habitat. And so your melding of your technical sciences, with our traditional knowledge and your advocacy and your public education functions as you go forward in your career will be very relevant here. And beyond that, I can't be more specific.
All right, let's thank Mr. Walter. So we'd like to honor your coming and speaking to us and sharing your wisdom, so we appreciate that. So these ladies are going to roll with the blessing. Thanks for your time.
This is a special blanket. It was made for our college. It's reversed.
Wow.
To represent our house of learning. Yeah.
Wow, that is so cool. My wife's going to take that from me.
All right, let's thank you one more time.